Okay. Thank you very much, everyone, and thanks for joining another one of our Meet the Gurus events. As many of you know, this is sponsored by Starweaver and dedicated to spreading ideas, knowledge, and insights in short form, typically less than 30 minutes, about all sorts of things in technology, business, entertainment, entrepreneurship. And today, we have a fantastic program with Sahil Khosla, who is deep into all elements of technology, and it's all about, in this discussion, about demystifying software for product managers. So, with that, Sahil, welcome. Thanks very much for taking the time.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so with that, I think everyone has had enough to hear about me and about my background. Let's talk a little about you. How did you get into the whole business of technology, and how did you end up doing what you do today? And then we'll get into that as well.
Yeah, it all starts early, right? Like from very early stages, not even in your career, but the early stages of your life, you start to identify some things that you enjoy. And I've always enjoyed building as much as breaking stuff. And that you start to put the two and two together, and you realize, oh, that sounds like something like engineering, and maybe that is what I should pursue as a career. So for me, it's all about building good stuff that solves problems. And in this day and age, it's all done through technology. So that got me interested to pursue the path of engineering. Initially, I started off as an electrical engineering major, and my focus was more on sort of building hardware products. But the landscape changed very quickly. Everything shifted towards more software, and I jumped on that boat as well. And this all started when the first iPhone came out, and they launched the App Store. Everyone wanted to jump on that ship. Everyone wanted to build apps, and I was one of them. So that's how I got started. And I was fortunate enough to work for some of the big software companies and gain some experience that way. So here I am, going from tinkering with tiny little products to now managing a bunch of engineers who build some great stuff for the customers.
Yeah, well, fantastic. Sorry, I'm just doing a little bit of audio adjustment here. So as you said, you get into technology, you find out things don't always happen. So invert polarity, that's kind of an interesting thing I've never had to do, but there we go. So, okay. So, great. Let's talk a little about product management, because that's what this is all about. We've got limited time. Help me understand, what does a product manager do? So take us from the basics of the fundamentals. You're interested in this idea. You love the idea of building a product, but what does a product manager actually do?
Well, product managers have an interesting, it's a very interesting role. It's probably one of the most unique roles you will find in an engineering org. The product manager is, at the end of the day, a spokesperson for the users. They are there to help build stuff that is going to solve some real world problems for the end user, right? Mm-hmm. They can't do it themselves. Otherwise, they would be writing code. So they need to work with engineers to do it. They are representing the customer. They're representing the users who are facing a problem. And the product manager's role is to translate that problem into something that the engineers can take and then go build and develop and then ship it back to the end user. So as I said, like at the end of the day, they are a spokesperson for the end user. So they are really there to bridge that gap that, hey, here's the problem we need to solve. We don't know how to solve it. That's why we have you. So tell us what are some of the options? What are the best ways to approach this problem? What can we do so that when the next day this user or the customer uses that product, they feel 1% better. They feel that this technology that this company built or this team built really helps me improve some aspect of my life. It could be as simple as a to-do list, or it could be as complex as launching a rocket. But at the end of the day, you're solving problems, and the product manager's role is to bridge that gap between who's facing the problem and who's going to solve the problem. Right. So that's pretty much the core of it, right? And they wear multiple hats. They have to represent the business because there's investments required. They have to represent technology because there's engineers required to solve the problem, and they also have to kind of keep in mind the customers, of course, because they are their spokesperson. So it's like these three things coming together for a product manager.
Which of those? I don't know if you can put a level of importance. Like if you're in a healthcare company versus a company doing space shots, versus how much of the business do you need to understand versus, from what the company does versus the software engineering perspective on whether they're on one technology or another. And then, so what elements of these things need to be balanced? And if you're working into this, do you really need a technical background or a domain background expertise?
Yeah, so the answer is going to differ, right? Like the answer is going to be very different for the domain that you're operating in. For example, if you are in healthcare, then it is a pretty heavily regulated environment, and you would absolutely need to understand some of those challenges, because you can't just decide one day you show up to work and you say, hey, we're going to MVP how we serve something to the patients. No, that's not going to fly, because you need to go through certain levels of approvals, and neither can you do when you're in like a company like NASA or SpaceX. Like you can't do that. So the mileage will vary. But if you are a sort of unregulated startup or a tech company where you're building day-to-day use products, you don't need to have that much domain knowledge. It's more about just the end problem that you're solving. So the answer will depend. And to answer your other question about whether you need to have a technology background, I won't necessarily say you do. That's at least my personal experience. But I would still say you need to be savvy. Like you need to still understand. Like you should be the number one user of the product that you're building, and you should really have a passion for it. Because if you don't have the passion for that, solving that particular problem, you're not going to be able to think like that, and not going to be able to get these ideas on the table. So it all depends, but the more you know, the better, of course.
Right. So how do you? I mean, is this really across the spectrum? A product manager from a tiny startup with 2 people in a garage is the same skill requirements essentially as a person who's helping SpaceX, shoot a rocket to Mars or to the outer limits of the Earth?
Yeah. No, I think it differs, of course. I think if the smaller the team, the less sort of bureaucracy and less sort of hoops to jump through. You can be very agile. You can be really experimenting. You can move fast. You can, in some cases, when you start the company, you're all in one. You are the engineer and you are the product manager, right? So you're literally playing both roles. But as the company grows and you have more delineation between the engineers and the product manager, you will probably have one PM, right? And that person is going to maybe even roll up their sleeves if required and get in with the team, because every day the challenges are different and they're moving fast, they're taking decisions on the spot, they're pivoting quickly. So it's a very different take. But as the company size and the responsibilities increase, you're going to have to really learn to leverage the people around you and work. You'll have to work with more people. You'll have to jump through more hoops. There will be more formal processes in place that you have to go through. So it changes. There are different challenges for both. But yeah, it's going to differ a lot for sure.
In terms of balancing these various audiences and constituents that you as the program manager deal with, obviously, presumably you have to also be fairly diplomatic, right, in all of these roles that you're playing. So, you can't mandate to the customer what they want, and you need to be flexible to understand and communicate to them that, well, maybe you can't get what you need as quickly as you want because our software team can't do that. So how do you juggle the various constituents, the internal customers, the external customers, the tech teams, the people in the business side? I mean, that's a big question, but can you help us slice that and see where we go?
Yeah, I would say it's more about building these relationships, right? Like you need to have a solid relationship with your customer if you are in that kind of business where you have sort of fixed set of clients and not just millions of users. You obviously can't have, even in case of millions of users, you should know some of your customers like really well who use your products day to day. And also in terms of internally with stakeholders, with engineering teams, it's all about building relationships and understanding where everyone is coming from, because everyone wants to do the right thing, is trying to do the right thing, but there's limited resources in all cases, right? Like there's limited engineers, there's limited hours. So you really have to understand where everyone's coming from and have empathy for their own challenges, and then try to, and that is your number one role as a product manager, to carve out a way which is going to satisfy most people. And sometimes it's just not going to happen. Sometimes you have to say no to somebody, which is absolutely fine, as long as you know the reason why you're doing that. It's not to hold like something personal against anyone. It's just about you're trying to do this balancing. But if you have a good relationship with them, you can go back to them and explain to them that, hey, we have 10 things to do. This can't be one of them, but we'll do it soon after. So explaining to them, having that leveraging that relationship. And again, one of the biggest challenges for product managers, engineers don't report to them. So they have to get everything has to be done through influence and inspiration. Like you don't have, in traditional terms, authority over these engineers. So it's about having a good working relationship with them and inspiring them to build a great product. And you'll just see the results yourself.
So a combination of diplomacy simplified to diplomacy and communication skills, right? And being able to then maybe time management obviously is a critical one as well, balancing your own time, but also the understanding how much can fit into a given cycle of product management, product development.
Yeah, absolutely. And influence, right? And influence. So you have to build that, but that you build over time.
Yeah, and it's pretty exciting because you're actually defining the product as you go, right? Sometimes it's clearly defined in advance, but as we all know these days, the so-called MVP, the acronym used before the minimum viable product, people build this massive thing, wait months, and they find out that it's not even, needed in the market. It's the wrong thing. It was built wrong. It had the wrong ideas behind it. So in terms of that, presumably you're also, you said the voice of the customer, but you're also the one that's probably most essential in defining that MVP.
Absolutely.
Right? Or helping craft it, and then taking input from all these constituents. So how do you define the product life cycle? So, obviously there are sprints, there are stories, there's epics, there's all these things within the Agile framework and the Agile world. But how do you, as a product manager, the joke is, how do you eat this elephant one bite at a time, right? This massive thing, how do you decide the prioritizations of that, where we need to get to, and how we keep that customer smiling, that 1% as you just described before?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, it's like starting backwards almost. Like you have to have that North Star vision in place before you even get to write a single line of code, right? Like, what is it that you would want in X amount of time, 5 years amount of time? Like for me, it's about approaching the long game. Like, if this product is successful, where would this product be in several years down the lane? So you have that vision in mind and kind of start backwards. Okay, what is it going to take me or take the team to get there? And that means getting your fundamentals in place first. So like first thing for most products like this is to get your fundamentals in place. Like, don't try to build, especially with this modern technology with apps and things like that. When we're talking about software, don't try to get it perfect because then you will forever be in that cycle of getting it perfect and never actually get it out, and only to find out that this wasn't even the right thing to build. So have that end product in mind and try to carve out the slightest piece of that can be put in front of the customers. And this has taken even a step further now. Like, you don't even have to build it. Like, with all these all these prototyping tools that you have in place, you can even test your idea without even writing a single line of code by building a prototype, getting in front of the customers. And then you get some validation that sort of impacts your design. You make some adjustments. And once you think you're in the right direction, that's when you start to build it. Get something basic ready with like the minimum number of features, and then put it out there. And then the best thing you can do for a product is to have that data feedback loop, right?
Yep.
You put it out there, you start collecting some data, and then let data define your thinking. And maybe you will be walking forever in the direction of your North Star, or maybe you will have to change course. But let the data define. If you have the data, then the decision is easy because you're not lost. You're just relying on that data that's coming your way.
Yep. That's actually what I was just going to be my next question about the tools and the frameworks that you use. And you described the rapid prototyping and do you have some favorites that you find to be really useful and certainly maybe for beginners or people who are just getting into product management? What are your favorites? Do you have a few of them?
Well, I would almost say that even if you don't have any tools, right? Like, you always have the pen and paper. You always have traditional surveys that you can put out there. You can even, I've seen people like walk up to me, offer me a $10 gift card in exchange for some questions. Like, even before prototype, you can just start to collect some data that way, like very, very traditional way. But once you have some data together, then, you can start to use some tools. There's tons of them online. Framer is one that comes to mind, or basic, just use your basic, even PowerPoint, like put together some kind of a mock-up with just the wireframes and put it in front of some people who would be interested in that product. And there's also this great website called usertesting.com that where you can actually pay some people to actually try to use your product. You give them a scenario, and then they tell you what they feel about it, whether it was something that they expected, and what was their take on it. So there's tons of these things that you can do in the early stages. One story comes to mind. There's a acquaintance in Chicago who started a company called ShipBob, and I remember so what they do is, because going to the post office is painful, and you have to stand in the line, and you have to kind of pay for it and then ship. So they wanted to solve that problem, right? So it's a real world problem. So the idea was that what if we could go to people's houses and wherever they live and collect the package from them and ship it on their behalf, so there's someone else would be, so they don't have to stand in line. So they actually, in the early days, went out to the post offices and talked to people in the line. How much would you be willing to pay
to not stand in this line? To not be standing in this line. Exactly. And particularly now. How long ago was this? Was this pre-COVID, or is this?
It was pre-COVID, but it's been a few years ago. But now imagine, and they're doing great because they talked to real people. They talked to real. There was a real problem, and they found out that people were willing to spend a lot of money to get out of that line, so they can go back to whatever they were doing.
Right. Right, it's kind of like a version of the being the pickup service from the Federal Express or UPS that the U.S. Post Office does not have. And I'm sure it's a common problem throughout. That's a fascinating idea. So, in terms of this, is that really then where you're asking people, would you want me to weigh your package? Do you need postage stamps that you don't have at home? Because these are obviously some of the pieces of the puzzle. One was the overall idea, which you described.
Right.
But then there's the nitty-gritty, should I have a scale with me, and how do I know the scale's accurate, and all that? Can you sell U.S. postage stamps, right, like Stamps.com and others do? So how do you, what level of detail and sort of granularity do you get into, and maybe it steps along the way, but how do you again eat that elephant one bite at a time?
Yeah, exactly. So only solve the problems that are current. So to get your MVP out, what are all the problems that you need to solve, right? So solve for those, and if something is going to delay your MVP by a significant amount of time, maybe it makes sense to, of course, in some cases you can't do it because of regulations, whatever, but if you're in sort of more flexible environment, it's best to, give it some thought, but if you think it's it's doable, but it's going to delay the MVP by X amount of time. And then ask yourself a question, whether it makes sense to delay it or to put it in front of the customers, get the data flowing, and then start worrying about solving that other problem, right? Mm-hmm. So you don't have to have everything solved right away, because chances are you might not even need it because maybe customers don't even want it. But again, you won't know that until you ship something, get some data going, and learn from your customers, because that's the most valuable piece of information that you're going to get.
So let's look at that as an example, where you have a big product. I mean, it has a lot of features, and then you're sort of trying to figure out, and let's just talk about a digital product this moment, sort of you're online, but you feel that the product needs to have 3 or 4 pieces to it. Let's assume for a second you've got one, and you've really got a really good version, part of one, but it just won't feel like a complete product unless you tease customers, if you will, describe to customers what those 2, 3, and 4 will be. Right. Is it there that you begin to ask the customers online, you're saying, and how would you position that? Maybe there's not a single answer, but you say, look, we're thinking about adding this. We want to add this. We believe this is valuable. Tell us what you think. So do you do that, or do you not show those features, the potential for those features?
Well, no. Again, it depends, but there's several ways to kind of bypass that, right? Like if you have a prototype already in place with those features, kind of do like a mini demo of what it's coming, what it's building, like what's cooking, like kind of do like a teaser video that this is
to live customers. To the customers who are already on your, it's like, the guy goes out to the person who's picking up the package now, and they say, oh, by the way, we were thinking about offering this. Is that the kind of thing you're saying?
Yeah, exactly, right? Like, so if someone landed on your website or your web app, chances are they are somewhat interested in your product, right? Right. So that is the perfect time to tease them and show them, even though it's something we don't have right now, it's in the works and we are cooking. So some kind of a teaser video, some kind of post, or some companies even post their feature backlog online, that these are all the things that are in the works. Absolutely. So some companies definitely post their feature backlog, and actually ask customers to post towards their feature backlog as well, to let customers request features, right? So that's one way. The other way is to do it more subtly, where let's say you have an app and you already have some core features that are working, people are using, and you're thinking about introducing a new feature. Oftentimes I would see that there appears a button, or there appears a link, or there appears something like that where it says, it grabs my attention that, hey, this is there. I click on it, it says coming soon. It's not even there yet. Maybe they will never build it. But by that virtue of that click, they gathered a data point that, oh, only 2% of the people clicked on it, so maybe it's not worthwhile. But 90% of the people are clicking on it, maybe there's something to it. So you can take that subtle approach as well. So
that's the data cycle. I mean, it's more. It's actually, you're describing it. Let's just take your ShipBot idea, or customer friend who has this company. How do you feedback that data? I mean, at one point, let's use an example. You've got 50 people who are your ShipBot couriers. Do you need to have that app for them to sort of ask the customer those questions? Is that the kind of data aggregation you need? Or do you need to have them come back at the end of the day having coffee or a drink and sit around and say, look, I've got a lot of customers. So how granular, I guess, and how precise, I guess, is my question. Do you need that data versus anecdotal evidence that, because, as we all know, the focus groups and sort of so if you use anecdotal data, the person with the biggest mouth and the person with the strongest opinions,
of course,
may well be the one who wins the day, but they may have the least accurate data. So how do you balance those things?
Right. So I think, especially when you're small, this data, you have to take it with a grain of salt, right? Like, it's more directional. It's more to validate whether you're walking in the right direction or not. It's nothing more. But as you become really big, then I worked at companies where you have millions of users. Then you have proper data scientists looking at this data to reach statistical significance, because otherwise the data is meaningless. If you don't have significance, if you don't reach that kind of level of confidence in your data, then it's useless. So you start with some direction, but then as you grow, then that data must reach that kind of statistical significance, because otherwise, it's in fact, it's not going to be useful. And I even remember sometimes when we used to run tests, you have both groups kind of behaving the same way. So like the experimental group behaves the same way, the other group behaves the same way. So the company challenged the product managers and engineers to only build experiments that are either going to win or lose. If it's a neutral, it's not a good experiment.
Right. That's an interesting point. Part of behavioral science, right? The behavioral science of how do you define an A/B test, how do you define a feature that is different enough for someone to care.
Exactly.
Like or dislike, by the way, right? Like or dislike, but care.
Like or dislike, no neutral. Because if you spend all that time and at the end of the day you got nothing out of it, you got perfect 50-50 split, you didn't learn anything. So you have to be a little more radical. You have to not play it safe all the time. You have to have your idea out there so that it's going to move the needle, either really hurt people or really have people like it. So the more radical your idea is going to be, the more chances of you knowing which way it went.
Is there as you're speaking, I'm thinking of the explosion of bots, from Drift to IBM bots, Watson bots, to others that are out there that are pushing information capture, right, and customization of that information. So to what extent have you ever seen, or do you believe, maybe we'll start out, do you believe those are valuable methods for product definition as well? So, for example, maybe you picked, I'm going to throw this out as an idea, you pick the IP of people from Belgium, and you decide you need to test whether they like white chocolate or dark chocolate, right? So you decide, you pick out from your system, you can maybe slice the data that clearly. Do you believe a bot versus, kind of like maybe a survey is in the cards, or is it a reality, or is it just my, fantasy that something like that might exist?
Sorry, how do you define a bot in this case? What would be their role?
A bot popping up on a screen, which I've done, and literally saying to you, Sahil, can I ask you a question? You look at that and think, well, that's a little strange. Okay, yes. It pops up and it says, and then it looks like it's working, and then it comes back and says, are you a chocolate lover? Yes, no, not sure. And then grabs that information down a pipeline of helping you to answer that question in a product development fashion, not selling them, because most of those things seem to be selling you something, but some of them are helping you navigate a system, etc. Do you think, have you ever used that? Is that something that you've heard of?
So there's several ways of doing that. There are some smarter than others. And you can have this explicit way where something pops up and some people might just dismiss it as a distraction that, hey, get out of here. I just need to focus on what I'm here to do.
Sure.
But always when it comes to these things, if your product is, or even if you're talking about a bot, if it's designed in a way that is going to help both sides, so the customer and you, it's more likely to get engagement.
Right.
If the customer is not getting anything out of it, then they're more likely to dismiss it, right? That's just my personal experience.
Well, it sounds like the whole survey business, right? The world of surveys, where people answer surveys with the people who are most opinionated, and therefore you get probably very bad data, as we saw in elections, et cetera, where you don't really know because it's the only opinionated people. You don't really get the engagement that you just described, right?
Yeah, exactly. So the more chances of success are in something more implicit, where the customer doesn't even know that they're. It almost sounds negative, but it's not the case. But so the great example that comes to mind is the language app Duolingo. So how did it start out? So literally, the founder of Duolingo, actually the first product that founder created was the CAPTCHA that we see, where you have to enter the letters whenever you go to a website. So what was it doing? It was actually the books that Google scans, words from those books, and they had people type those letters because they were translating these scans into real text. So they use everyone across the globe to translate the books for free. And so they solved two problems. They solved the CAPTCHA problem, where the bots were just hitting the website, so no longer they couldn't hit the websites any longer because you had to prove that you're human and read and then type the alphabets. They solved the problem for Google, where they translated millions of books from scans to actual text without anyone knowing, without anyone ever knowing that every time you type that piece of text, you are helping Google translate a book. And every time they got some significance on, okay, 100 people type this letter the same way, it must be accurate, or whatever data model they use behind the scenes, they use that word, and it was then used as the final word for that particular piece of text. So the same person came up with this idea when it comes to learning a language. So the app Duolingo, so behind the scenes, what's really happening is when you're practicing on Duolingo, Google, or I don't know which service they use anymore, but they send you a piece of text in English and ask you to translate it because you're practicing your translation skills, or like Spanish into English. So every time you translate it, you think you're learning a language, but behind the scenes, they're actually helping translate some pieces of text. So when 10 people translate something from Spanish to English the same way, they consider that, oh, this is good. Everyone's saying the same thing. It must be right. And you just ended up helping someone translate a piece of text. So that's where it's more implicit, where you got some data back. At the same time, you solve some problem behind the scenes without anyone ever knowing.
So it's kind of funny. We just got a question in. I don't know where the source came from, but it came on from one of the social media channels. So when it comes to gathering data and privacy being a topic of importance these days, what is an ethical method of collecting user data? You're now put in the real challenging position of answering a kind of political and economic and sort of ethical and legal question.
Yeah, definitely, I won't say is my area of expertise when it comes to that legal aspect of it, but usually it's somewhere in the fine print. And of course, if it's only being used to sort of enhance the product, which is in turn just going to help the users, it makes sense. But yeah, if you're going to be selling that data further for others to use and kind of benefit off of, then it's a very different game. Then you're kind of crossing the line, and it has to be handled very differently. But it's only if it's only in spirit of, especially if you're a free product and you want to improve that product.
Right.
I mean, it's just another way of learning from customers, right? Like versus talking to them in person, you just collect some implicit data points. So yeah, so there's a fine line.
So another question just came in. Is it a good idea to offer incentives to the user to answer surveys or gather data without the user knowing, looking at the larger picture, is this sustainable long term? I guess the question about sustainability is whether the incentives, at one point do you stop giving away gift cards and really, so that's a very interesting question.
Yeah, there's both, because the quality of the data is going to be very different, right? Like, because if you're just collecting implicitly on your app, you're just getting some data points and you're just getting some metrics, okay, 90% of the people or 80% of the users. But when you are actually going to invite someone to have their time to have a one-on-one conversation, it makes sense to compensate them in some way if that's how if your company can support that, because then you're getting a more qualitative, more one-on-one, more detailed information in addition to the data points, actually how the users feel about using your product. So yeah, there's both approaches that you can do. I even worked for a company who had a full lab where customers would come in for a couple of hours and they were hooked on with all these things. The camera was watching their eyeball movements and whatnot. So you can go to different levels.
Yeah, you can think about so many different alternatives in everyday life where gathering information can be intrusive, and it's I've forgotten what which of the scientific principles of the observation of the object changes its position or changes its behavior. I guess it's a physics subatomic particle. By observing the particle, you change its behavior. So by observing the customer, you may change its behavior depending on how you observe them, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, definitely. That is something to be, and that's why these experts who design these studies have they've done, several studies, so they know how to craft the question without impacting the answer.
Right. So again, this is a great program. It's short. It's to the point. I know you have a course coming out soon on this whole subject, which is very interesting, and obviously the number of questions we've been getting, and there's some more that are here we don't have time for, but it's obviously a topic du jour. So Sahil, thanks for the time today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me. It was a great conversation, and I'll see you next time.
Yeah, thanks.